This week's topic is life during the Civil War. This war has changed the way people live. It's a war that will affect the people of the United States in a way that no other previous war has, and no other war has since. The one thing I did say in the Daily Agenda video that I wanted to do is read the lesson in the textbook first and then watch this video. So if you haven't done that, read it first, get the full view and the full information, and then that way I will just be further explaining or hopefully enriching your understanding of what you learned about during the reading. Now, I go out of order. The textbook has its own order, but I like to present my things my own way, so it's a little bit different from the textbook, but overall, same topics covered, same main topics. This video will let you know what's important and what kind of things you'll be looking at for the long quiz in 2 weeks on the Civil War. So, life during the Civil War. We're going to start with this idea of total war, and we've mentioned this before. Total war and what it means. Some of you guys seem to have grasped it, some of you guys not so much. But what total war is, it actually means a couple things. One is the actual fighting. It's warfare without any reservations. The armies are holding nothing back. The weaponry is advanced, and people are trying to totally annihilate each other in battle and in war. They're not just trying to annihilate the other side's soldiers and armies, they're trying to annihilate their resources. So you'll see things like farms and food supplies and buildings completely destroyed in order to attack the enemy in that way, not physically to kill them, but to weaken them in any way possible. Both sides are trying to do this, but it's really going to affect the South because most of the war is fought on Southern soil. So their livelihood, their way of life is going to be completely destroyed in this idea of total war. And total war isn't how either of these sides necessarily wanted to conduct the war, but it was becoming increasingly necessary as the North realized they had to do it to defeat the South. Now, the other aspect of total war is that everybody in the country, no matter who you are, is involved in the war. You cannot escape it. It's happening, and you are affected by it. You might not be a soldier fighting in the war, but you probably know someone who is. You might not be making weapons, but you know someone who is or is sending their food supply to the war. New things like income tax are going to come in here, which means that you're being taxed for the first time in this country's history. People are being taxed on the money they make, and that's going towards the war. A lot of people are farmers, so instead of paying money, they send a certain percentage of the food supply that they make to the army, to the government, to support the war effort. Again, you cannot escape it. It's always there. This is different from how war was done in the past, where there might be several months where nothing's happening in the winter. Both armies will kind of just agree that it's not the best time to fight, and there won't be too much going on in those times. War is always happening. It's constant in total war. You guys might be aware of it, but we've been at war since you guys have been alive. Since the early 2000s, we've been involved in conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. But these aren't like the total war that we saw in the Civil War. We can ignore it. We may not be too affected by it. Maybe you know someone who's serving in the Army and who's been over there. I do, but when they're not over there, when they're not doing that, it's not always on my mind. There's not heavy fighting as it was back then. So total war is different. You can't ignore it. Everybody's involved and it's constantly on their mind. One of the reasons that was because back then in the Civil War, it was the first war that was documented in terms of being in the paper every day, and newspapers, which were around before in the Revolution and other wars, but they weren't as widespread and they weren't able to be updated daily like they were with information because of the telegraph and because of trains. Photographs were invented not long before the Civil War, and now they're coming out. And guys like Matthew Brady here is showing the war to everybody, so now everybody can see the horrors of war firsthand. The other part that goes along with that is issues like the draft. Um, First time that there's a draft in the United States where people are being um, called upon to serve without volunteering to serve. At first, both the Union and the Confederates relied on volunteers, but as the death toll mounted and the need for soldiers in the war dragged on, both sides recognized that they needed more people and they couldn't just do it based on volunteers. So a couple years into the war, the Union passes a draft law and requires all able-bodied men from ages 20 to 45 to serve. People younger and people older than that served as well, but all of those people in that age group, men in those age group, were required to serve if they were called upon. A draft, you might think of the NFL draft and the NBA draft when you hear the word draft. They don't pick the best people to be soldiers; they pick at random. And as long as you're healthy, you have to serve. The one exception was if you were rich, you could get out of it in a number of ways. You could pay a certain amount of money to take your place, or you could pay someone else to take your place and say, this person will fight on my behalf. But most people couldn't afford that, and therefore the draft caused a lot of tension in the North, where people did not want to fight in this war that they saw as a rich man's war fought by poor people. And riots were common. The biggest one is in New York City. There's a movie featuring that, Gangs in New York. Great movie. You can watch it when you're older. It's rated R, so stay away from it now. But it shows the effects of these riots where dozens of people are killed and the whole of life in society is changing because of it. One very important thing, and this is still in question today, still contention. People who think Lincoln is a great president, but there are some people who think he's not because of some things he did during his presidency to expand his federal authority that kind of hasn't gone away. The presidency is expanded during wartime, as it always is, and this is one example of it. Lincoln suspended the right of habeas corpus, which means that people have a right to be charged and to have a hearing. That they deserve to know why they are being arrested. You can't just arrest someone for no reason, essentially. But Lincoln suspends that as a result of these riots, saying during the war, federal government, the president has the authority to hold anybody without reasoning because of public safety. And that's kind of a contention that people will still fight about things like that today. And it certainly is a right that you deserve to know what you are being charged with if you are charged with a crime. So mainly, the war will again affect every aspect of life, but it will affect the South and the North in different ways because at this point, even leading up to the war, the South and North have diverged from one another, and they are very different places in terms of their economy and even of their culture. Now, both sides will suffer from what is called inflation, which is the decrease in the purchasing power of money. So, for example, of what inflation might be, you could say at the start of the war or at the start of any event or conflict, say you could buy something for, say, buy a loaf of bread for we'll say 10 cents. I'm not sure what it actually cost back then, but say you could buy a loaf of bread for 10 cents at the beginning of the war. Well, because of inflation, because the Union and the Confederate governments are both printing money, just adding more and more money to the nation's money supply, but they're just doing it kind of without any checks or balances. If there's more money out there, that means the money is worth less individually. So now a 10-cent loaf of bread might cost 30 cents or 40 cents by the middle or the end of the war because the money itself is worth less. The bread stays the same. People still need bread for the same reasons, and loaf of bread can still feed the same amount of people, but the money, since there's more of it, it is less. The South is also suffering for a number of reasons. One being the Union blockade is crippling their economy, which is a agrarian economy, growing a few crops, mainly cotton, and they need to export that cotton. They need to send it over to places like Europe or to the industrial north to sell it and to make money off it. Well, if the union's blocking all the ports, they can't do that, and therefore they are losing out on that. For the same reason, they can't import anything, and the acts of total war are destroying their cities and their countryside, so they're low on food. People are starting to experience famine and starvation. The North, again, is suffering in some ways. We already mentioned they're paying income tax for the first time. That will end at the end of the war. It won't come back for another 60 years after the war. But in some ways, they're actually profiting because as the Industrial Revolution continues and war is calling for new things that are needed, new inventions and things like that, the industry is profiting. They are making new things for the war effort. Sometimes just out of the natural course of things, and they are not being blockaded. They can still trade with other countries. They can still produce a lot of goods. So they actually are growing. Although some of the people are suffering, the overall economy in the North will grow as a result of the war, as is often the case after the Great Depression and World War II. The economy recovered as a result of us going into World War II. So this is almost a common theme throughout history. War can actually be profitable for many people, and it also can have the effect of jump-starting a slowing economy, as it has done a few times. So, last thing I want to talk about today, before we talk about emancipation, tomorrow, is the role of women in the war. We've mentioned a few before, but there are, history often will, in earlier times especially, downplay the contributions of women and focus on the warriors or the soldiers and the men like that. But there are women there. They're the second half of every story that we tell. Even though, again, history has not always been kind and shown that part of the story. But women were in the war. They were more than just the nurses and the factory workers we talked about today. They were women that served as scouts and spies and even soldiers. This woman right here, Frances Clayton, pretended to be a man just so she could fight, and fight she did. Harriet Tubman served as a spy and a scout and continued to work with the Underground Railroad, freeing slaves. As we'll mention tomorrow, a quarter of the slaves of the South will escape during the war. They'll use the conflict as cover and as a reason to escape to freedom, and people like Harriet Tubman will continue to help them through that. But the women raised money for their war. They made the weapons, the ammunition, supplies that would go to them, and there were many women that served as nurses, as surgeons, and as battlefield aides throughout the war. So rather than try to explain a bunch of their contributions, there are some famous names that we've talked about before and some other names that we'll talk about in the future as well. But you can learn more about them. There's a link here, and you can click on that in the PowerPoint that I've posted if you want to learn more about them. It's from one of the websites that I posted yesterday to study for your topic and research. If you have a related topic, it might be a good one to do. All right, so that's what we have for today. Life during the war is changed. It's going to be changed forever because this war is like no war ever before. It's a total war. It's a war that has effect on every aspect of society. Okay, so tomorrow we'll talk about emancipation and how it affected the slaves and the free African Americans as well in this country.